Germany produces more of them than any other submarine.
The Type 7 U-boat is actually a bit on the small side. They're one of the smaller submarines of the First World War. It did have significant seagoing capacity.
On May 8, 1945, something unprecedented happened in the North Atlantic. Over 150 German submarines, the most feared weapons of the Second World War, rose to the surface, not to attack, not to escape, but to surrender. These were the same U-boats that had terrorized Allied shipping for 6 years, the same machines that had sent over 3,500 vessels to the bottom of the ocean, the same steel coffins that had drowned tens of thousands of sailors. And now, their exhausted crews were hoisting white flags as Allied aircraft circled overhead. Within months, nearly every single one of them would be gone, deliberately sunk, blown apart, erased from existence. The Allies had decided that this fleet was too dangerous to keep and too advanced to let fall into the wrong hands. But here's what they didn't count on. Some of those submarines refused to stay buried. Decades later, divers exploring the cold waters of the North Atlantic discovered something that shouldn't have been there.
An Italian diver discovers an astonishing U-boat wreck. The submarine is virtually intact.
Submarines resting on the seafloor with their decks still armed, their hatches sealed shut, hiding secrets the military never wanted found. What they pulled from those wrecks would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the final days of the Third Reich.
The Atlantic Ocean was the scene of the most important battle of the Second World War between the submarines of the Third Reich.
One submarine was found 3,000 miles from where records claimed it sank. Another was carrying cargo so sensitive that intelligence officials went silent when they saw what was inside. And a handful were preserved so perfectly that you can walk through them today and touch the same steel that once hunted Allied ships. This is what really happened to Germany's U-boats after World War II. And trust me, the ending of this story is something you won't see coming. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland.
Germany had signed its unconditional surrender. And within hours, a single order went out to every German submarine still at sea. It came from Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, and the man who had commanded the U-boat fleet throughout the war. The message was simple. All U-boats were to cease operations immediately, surface and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. No exceptions, no last-ditch attacks. The war beneath the waves was over. What happened next was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Across the North Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay, and the frozen fjords of Norway, more than 150 U-boats rose from the depths. Some had been underwater for weeks, their crews surviving on stale air and dwindling rations. Others had been preparing for one final mission, torpedoes loaded, targets in sight. But now, all of them surfaced, their exhausted sailors stepping into daylight for the first time in what felt like forever. Think about that for a moment. 6 years of relentless warfare, thousands of ships sent to the bottom, entire convoys wiped out in a single night. And now, it was over. Just like that. The submarines sailed towards surrender ports in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and southern England. At places like Loch Erebol and Lisahally, Allied warships escorted them in, one by one. Royal Navy and US Navy boarding parties climbed aboard each submarine, seizing codes, charts, and weapons. Engineers catalogued the rusted, battle-scarred vessels, many of which were barely seaworthy after months of continuous operations. At Loch Erebol alone, nearly 40 U-boats anchored together in what witnesses later described as a parade of defeat. Row after row of grey steel, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, now waiting in silence to learn their fate. The logistics were immense. Submarines had to be towed and secured from ports across occupied Europe. A few never made it, scuttled by their own crews or lost to mechanical failure before reaching land. The men aboard were taken into captivity. Some were interrogated for intelligence, especially the engineers who understood the advanced propulsion systems and torpedo technology. Others sat in camps for months, uncertain whether they would ever see home again. By late 1945, most of the surviving crews were repatriated to a defeated, divided Germany, but their submarines stayed behind, and that created a problem no one had anticipated. The Allies now possessed the world's most advanced submarine fleet. Hundreds of cutting-edge war machines that had revolutionized undersea warfare. The question was obvious. What do you do with them? Some wanted to study them, others wanted to share them. But a growing number of military leaders had a different idea entirely, and what they proposed would erase most of these machines from existence forever. By the autumn of 1945, British harbors were clogged with captured German submarines. Dozens of them sat rusting at anchor, their ballast tanks leaking, their engines seizing up from neglect. Keeping them afloat was expensive. Storing them indefinitely was impossible, and no one could agree on what to do with them. So the Royal Navy came up with a solution that still baffles historians to this day. They decided to destroy them, all of them, tow the captured submarines out into the Atlantic and sink them one by one. They called it Operation Deadlight. The numbers were staggering. In total, 156 U-boats had surrendered to the Allies. Of those, 116 were designated for destruction. The Royal Navy divided the operation into 3 dumping zones, labeled XX, YY, and ZZs, roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland. There, in the cold, deep waters of the North Atlantic, the submarines would be sent to the bottom, some by naval gunfire, some by explosive charges, and some simply by opening their sea valves and letting the ocean pour in. The operation began in November 1945 and would continue through February 1946. Royal Navy tugs started towing groups of submarines from Scottish and Irish ports, dragging them out to the designated scuttling zones. But the process quickly became a disaster. Many of the U-boats were in dreadful condition. Some had been at sea for months without maintenance. Others had been battered by Allied bombing or deliberately sabotaged by their own crews before surrender. Their hulls were weakened by rust, their ballast systems were unreliable, and in the stormy winter seas of the North Atlantic, towing these unstable wrecks became a hazardous, often impossible task. More than a third of the U-boats never made it to the scuttling zones. 56 vessels foundered or sank on the way, dragged down by rough weather or structural failure. The Royal Navy recorded each loss, but made no effort to recover them. The goal was destruction, not preservation. If a submarine sank early, that was one less to deal with. The ones that did reach the dumping zones were finished off quickly. Destroyers and frigates used aerial rockets and naval gunfire to punch holes in the hulls. Crews watched as submarine after submarine slipped beneath the waves, joining the growing graveyard on the seafloor. Among the doomed vessels was U-2-336, the last U-boat to sink Allied ships during the war. It had surrendered at Lissahalli in June 1945 and was deliberately sunk off Ireland in January 1946. Another, U-295 met the same fate on December 17, 1945, after being towed from Loch Ryan. And U-2511, Germany's only fully operational Type 21 submarine at the war's end, was scuttled last on February 7, 1946, marking the official conclusion of Operation Deadlight. And just like that, it was over. The U-boat fleet that had terrorized the Atlantic for 6 years was gone, erased, buried beneath hundreds of feet of cold, dark water. Or so everyone thought, because the ocean has a way of keeping secrets. And in 2001, a maritime archaeologist named Innes McCartney set out to find what remained. What his team discovered would shock the entire naval history community. For decades, the Deadlight wrecks were forgotten. They lay on the seafloor off Northwest Ireland, marked only by coordinates on old Royal Navy charts that most people had never seen. The submarines were gone, the war was over, and nobody had any reason to go looking for them. Then, between 2001 and 2003, maritime archaeologist Innes McCartney led a series of expeditions to rediscover the lost fleet. Using sonar and deep-sea photography, his team scanned the dumping zones where the submarines had been sent to die. What they found was astonishing. At least 14 intact U-boat hulls were still sitting on the sea floor, preserved in the cold Atlantic mud. Many had sunk upright, their decks still armed, their steel now encrusted with decades of coral and marine growth. The findings revealed just how hastily Operation Deadlight had been carried out. Some of the submarines looked almost intact, as if they had simply been parked on the ocean floor and left to wait. Others showed the violent scars of gunfire and explosives, but all of them told the same story. The Allied forces had been in a hurry to make the U-boats disappear, and in that hurry, they had created one of the world's largest underwater graveyards. But here's where it gets interesting. McCartney wasn't the first person to stumble upon a forgotten U-boat in unexpected waters. 10 years earlier, in 1991, a group of wreck divers off the coast of New Jersey made a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about these submarines. John Chatterton and Richie Kohler were searching for unidentified wrecks using side-scan sonar. The waters off New Jersey are notorious among divers. Strong currents, low visibility, and depths that push the limits of technical diving. But about 60 miles off the coast of Point Pleasant, at a depth of 230 feet, their sonar lit up with an image that didn't make sense. A long, narrow object, torpedo-shaped, lying on the ocean floor. Something man-made, something old. But there was a problem. No submarine was supposed to be there. No wartime records showed a U-boat.
The U-boat skipper watches and confirms the explosion through his periscope, and a loud cheer grows up from his crew.
Lost anywhere near this location. No Allied attack reports. No German logs. Nothing. It was as if this submarine had simply materialized on the ocean floor and waited half a century to be found. The divers nicknamed it U-Hoo because no one could figure out what it was. When they made their first dive on the wreck, visibility was terrible, barely a few feet. The cold bit through their suits. The structure was partially buried in sand and tangled in decades of fishing nets, but a few passes around the hull confirmed the obvious. This was a submarine, a big one, German-made. They found gauges labeled in metric units, pipes and valves marked with the Kriegsmarine Eagle. But there was no hull number, no nameplate, nothing to identify which vessel this was. The conning tower had partially collapsed. The outer hull was cracked and rusting. Whatever had killed this submarine had done so violently and without warning. Over the next several years, Chatterton and Kohler became obsessed with solving the mystery. They made dive after dive, each one more dangerous than the last. Every expedition brought back new clues: plates, bowls, equipment marked with naval insignia, and then they found something that changed everything. A butter knife, tarnished but intact, engraved with a name, not a model number, a man's name. Using naval records and crew lists, the divers traced the name to a real person who had served on U-869. In 1997, 6 years after the first dive, the United States Navy officially confirmed what the divers had already proven. The wreck off New Jersey was U-869, and that raised a terrifying question. According to official records, U-869 had been sunk near Gibraltar, over 3,000 miles away. The wartime reports had been wrong for more than 50 years. The submarine that history said had died in European waters had actually met its end, just off the American coast. If U-869 was found where it shouldn't be, what else might be hiding beneath the waves? And more importantly, what was a German submarine doing off the American coast in the final months of the war? That question haunted researchers for years, but the answers would come from an unexpected place. Not from the wrecks themselves, but from the submarines that survived. Not all U-boats were destroyed in Operation Deadlight. The Allies weren't stupid. They knew that the German submarine fleet represented the cutting edge of underwater warfare, and they weren't about to throw away every advantage those machines could offer. The most advanced submarines, the Type 21 and Type 23 designs, were spared from the scuttling zones. These weren't just ordinary U-boats. They were revolutionary. The Type 21 in particular represented a complete rethinking of submarine design. Streamlined hulls built for speed underwater instead of on the surface. Greater battery capacity that allowed them to stay submerged for longer. Snorkel systems that let them run their diesel engines without fully surfacing. These were submarines designed to fight primarily beneath the waves, not above them. If Germany had deployed these submarines earlier in the war, military historians believe the Battle of the Atlantic could have ended very differently. The Allies had no effective counter for these machines. They were faster, quieter, and could stay hidden for far longer than anything that came before. And every major power wanted a peace. In August 1945, the Tripartite Naval Commission was formed to divide the spoils. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union each received 10 U-boats for examination, with priority given to the advanced designs. What followed was a technological feeding frenzy that would shape the Cold War for decades. The British Royal Navy put their captured submarines through rigorous testing. U-3017 was renamed HMSN-41 and subjected to submerged trials and endurance runs before being scrapped in 1949. Others were sent to Canada for use as training platforms, helping Allied crews develop new sonar and torpedo tactics against the very technology they had once feared. The Royal Navy also used captured German hulls to refine their depth charge tactics. Instead of testing explosives against mock targets, they could now detonate them near real German steel and measure the results. It was morbid but effective. The United States took their share just as seriously. Captured submarines were studied at naval facilities in Portsmouth and New London. Engineers examined propulsion systems, silent running technology, and periscope designs, features that would directly influence America's first post-war submarine classes. But one captured submarine stood out from all the others. U-234 was a long-range cargo submarine captured on May 14, 1945. while en route to Japan.
U-234 was assigned to deliver vital war materials to the Japanese.
When American sailors boarded the vessel, they expected to find standard military supplies. What they actually found sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. The submarine was carrying uranium oxide, jet engine components, technical drawings, and other advanced military technology intended for Japan's war effort. Some historians believe the uranium may have ended up contributing to the Manhattan Project, though this remains disputed. U.S. Navy engineers studied the construction and cargo of U-234 extensively before sinking it during weapons tests in 1947. The implications were clear. Germany had been far more advanced than anyone realized, and they had been sharing that knowledge with their allies until the very end. But perhaps no country benefited more from the captured U-boats than the Soviet Union. Soviet shipyards dissected the German hulls, plate by plate. They replicated the pressure-resistant architecture and snorkel systems, using the technology as a direct template for the later Whiskey-class submarines. Within years, the Soviets had built an entirely new fleet based on German designs. To the west, it was a worrying development. The same German engineering that had once hunted Allied convoys was now fueling an arms race beneath the Arctic ice. The Cold War hadn't officially started yet, but under the waves, it was already underway. Smaller nations benefited too. France took over several boats from Allied stockpiles as it rebuilt its navy after years of occupation. Norway and Denmark used captured submarines for training and coastal patrol. German submarine technology spread across Europe, infecting shipbuilding programs from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. By the end of the decade, most of the retained submarines had served their purpose. They were deliberately sunk or dismantled, but their influence proved lasting. The innovations of the Type 21 became the design foundation for nearly every conventional submarine built through the 1950s. In a very real sense, Germany's final wartime invention became the blueprint for the nuclear age. But here's what nobody expected. While governments were busy studying blueprints and dismantling hulls, a handful of these submarines survived completely intact. Some were preserved as museums, others sat forgotten in foreign navies, and a few ended up telling stories that no one had ever heard before. While hundreds of U-boats were scuttled or scrapped, a handful escaped destruction entirely and entered a new chapter of history. These survivors, scattered across Europe and North America, transformed from weapons of war into artifacts of remembrance. Among the best known is U-995.
German World War II submarine. U-955.
A submarine that surrendered at Trondheim, Norway in May 1945. After the war, it served briefly in the Norwegian Navy before being returned to Germany in 1965. Today, it rests at Le Beau, near Kiel, preserved as a museum ship beside the Marine Ehrenmal Memorial.
Close to the submarine now, and what you see over there, this tower, is a memorial for,
Visitors who step inside its narrow hull experience the oppressive quarters where 45 men once lived, worked, and fought for weeks at a time. The bunks stacked 3 high, the diesel fumes that never quite faded, the claustrophobic corridors where there was barely room to turn around. Every year, thousands of people walk through U-995. They touch the torpedo tubes, they sit in the captain's chair. They try to imagine what it was like to spend months beneath the waves, knowing that every dive might be your last. In France, several captured U-boats were used in the post-war Navy. U-123 was renamed Blaison, and became one of the few German submarines to see regular peacetime service under a foreign flag. When it was finally retired, it was preserved in Lorient, once one of the Kriegsmarine's main U-boat bases. The same harbor that had launched attacks on Allied shipping now hosted tourists curious about life beneath the waves. Other survivors exist in more unusual circumstances. U-534 was raised from the Kattegat Strait in 1993.
Has spent £3 million to raise U-boat 534, believing that it could contain valuable paintings, jewels, or even gold.
More than 40 years after it sank. Today, it's displayed in Birkenhead, England. Its hull has been cut into sections to reveal the claustrophobic interior, giving visitors a rare look at the machinery and living spaces that made submarine warfare possible. But perhaps the most famous survivor of all sits in a museum in the middle of America. U-505 was captured intact in June 1944 during a daring raid by the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic. A task force led by Captain Daniel Gallery spotted the submarine on the surface and launched an attack. Depth charges forced U-505 to surface, and American sailors boarded the vessel before its crew could scuttle it. It was the first enemy warship captured by the U.S. Navy.
In this moment, the U.S. sailors began their dramatic operation to capture the U-505 submarine.
Since the War of 1812, the capture was kept secret for the rest of the war. Allied intelligence didn't want the Germans to know that their codes and equipment had been compromised. After serving as an intelligence prize, U-505 was eventually transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. There it remains today, meticulously restored, the first enemy warship ever displayed on American soil. Millions of visitors have walked through its corridors, touched the same controls that German sailors once operated, and tried to imagine what it was like to hunt and be hunted beneath the ocean. But the majority of Germany's U-boats never reached museums. The wrecks from Operation Deadlight still line the seabed off Northwest Ireland, forming one of the world's largest underwater graveyards. For decades, they were forgotten, marked only by coordinates that gathered dust in naval archives. And then there are the ones we're still finding. U-869, the ghost submarine discovered off New Jersey, rewrote what we thought we knew about German operations near the American coast. When divers finally got inside, they found personal belongings, equipment, and documents that had been sealed since 1945. The wreck raised questions that historians are still trying to answer. What was its real mission? Why was it so far from where records said it should be? And what else might still be hidden in submarines we haven't found yet? For veterans and researchers alike, these submarines are more than relics. They're reminders of the human cost beneath the waves. Over 30,000 German submariners never returned from their patrols. Tens of thousands of Allied sailors died when their ships were torpedoed. The machines that once symbolized stealth and precision now stand for loss, innovation, and remembrance. Today, the preserved boats and the wrecks below the Atlantic serve as twin memorials. One above water, one below. They tell the final story of Germany's submarine fleet, an empire of steel that once ruled the ocean depths and now rests in silence between history and the sea. You can walk through U-995 at La Boe. You can stand next to U-505 in Chicago. You can touch the same steel that once stalked Allied convoys across the Atlantic. These machines aren't just museum exhibits anymore. They're graves, classrooms, warnings, and they're proof that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we tried to sink. What do you think happened to the U-boats that were never found? Let us know in the comments.